Hello guys, welcome back to biodiversity. This is chapter 10 section 3, the future of biodiversity. What have we done to ourselves and what can we do and what is happening with the world right now that we're going to have to fix? The future of biodiversity. Okay, so when we're talking about saving animals and saving individuals, we try to save them. We wind up saving one species at a time. We'll learn that that's not the best thing, but we'll talk about this. So saving one species at a time. When a species is clearly on the verge of extinction, concerned people sometimes make extraordinary efforts to save the last few individuals. That means sometimes we save it till a little too late before we take action, but we do try to save the last few individuals. The people then hope that a stable population might be restored someday. If we save enough to begin with, we might can restore the population. And the methods to preserve individual species often involve keeping and breeding those species in captivity. If we can save them and protect them, maybe eventually one day we can reestablish their population in the wild. So we've set up captive breeding programs. Okay, that's what these are right here. Wildlife experts may attempt to restore the population of a species through captive breeding programs. Captive breeding, that means they're in a zoo or in some sort of special place where we've set them up. The programs involve breeding species in captivity with the hopes of reintroducing those species out into the natural habitats. And then this type of program has been used very successfully with the California condor, for example, and with the wolves, and with kind of sort of pandas, but I don't think we've done much re-releasing. There's several programs where this has really worked really well, but the question remains is whether or not these restored populations will ever reproduce in the wild once they become reliant on humans, especially if they become reliant on humans for care and for food. They can't really hunt for themselves. One of the interesting things that they did with the condor is they would never let the condor, it's a vulture species, you can tell it's related to vultures, but they're huge and beautiful when they're flying, but they would never let the condor see humans at all ever. And they had a little condor looking puppet that they would feed the babies with, and trying to teach the babies to hunt on their own, to fly on their own, to flock on their own, without any interventions with humans. And that's why it worked really well. But in most programs, the human element of trying to save these animals is too great. They come to rely on us, or worse, they're not afraid of us. So that if they meet other humans in the wild, they're easy prey for poachers and such, because they're no longer afraid of humans. So we're going to see as we go on that there are some better options. All right. The trouble is, once we've done these captive breeding programs, can they reproduce in the wild without our help? So another way to save a species is just try to preserve their genetic material. Okay, trying to save their DNA so that we can use it later. So one way to save the essence of a species is by preserving its genetic material. It's called germplasm, which is basically the chromosomes and genes that is usually combined in the protoplasm of germ cells and may be stored as sperm, seeds, sperm, eggs, or pure DNA. One of the things they tried with this, or they were considering trying with this, is they have been able to gather DNA of mammoths, and then seeing if the elephants of today could be surrogate mothers, letting the elephant mother have a mammoth baby using genetic manipulation of her egg. And I don't know if they ever actually tried it, because there was a lot of question as to whether or not it was right. The environment of the mammoth no longer exists. So why would you put the mammoth into our environment now? Because our environment is so different. That wouldn't be really fair to them. And our own elephants are in so much jeopardy that we need to protect our own elephants, rather than trying to bring back mammoths. It's a whole big discussion, who's right, who's wrong. They never really did decide, but I know they haven't done it yet. But it's possible to be done. All right, so these germplasm banks will then store the germplasm in controlled environments for future use in research or species recovery efforts. So they'll hold on to the DNA, chromosomes, and genes in order for future use of either research or possible reintroduction and recovery efforts. Now, We also know that we can save the last few animals in zoos, aquariums, and parks. All right, so let's see about that. So in some cases, zoos now house the few remains of a species. The pandas is a good example. What we have here, pandas, Komodo dragons, rhinos. Some of the last species are held in zoos, the last hope for the survival of those species. The zoos, wildlife parks, aquariums, and botanical gardens are living museums of the world's biodiversity. But then, when those last ones die, they're gone. These kinds of facilities, though, rarely have enough resources or knowledge to preserve more than a fraction of the world's rare and threatened species. So even the best zoos are not nature. Even the best zoos are not natural habitats. Even the very best zoos don't have enough room for all of these animals, and they can only have a fraction of the world's rare and threatened species in the zoo. So how do we decide which ones belong? It's always the cute and cuddly or the interesting, but there are mundane and boring and even ugly animals that deserve just as much right to survive as the ones we keep in the zoo. So how do we decide which ones are the best? So there's a lot more study needed, always more study needed. Ultimately, saving just a few in the zoos does preserve the species as a captive, but they may not reproduce or survive again in the wild. So we might save a few, okay, but it doesn't preserve the species as a wild species anymore. They may not reproduce or survive again in the wild, so they're, pets now, basically. They're not wild animals anymore, even at the zoo, because if you turned them loose, they wouldn't be able to survive. So also, small populations are very vulnerable to infectious diseases and genetic disorders caused by inbreeding. Remember, we talked about this before with that bottleneck. If you have such a small population and you're trying to regrow the population from that small base, you'll have a lot of inbreeding and genetic diseases as the population grows. This is exactly what's happening with the pandas. We got to where they were almost all gone. Then the zoo programs did a great job of breeding more and breeding more and breeding more. The population is growing. However, the genetic base where we started from was so small. There was so little variability. There was a lot of inbreeding involved. And we know that with inbreeding comes a lot of genetic disorders. So even rebuilding the population, we don't have as much genetic variability as we would have in the wild. So that the conservationists hope that these strategies are a last resort to save the species. So putting them in a zoo or a park or a botanic garden or anything like that, yes, it will save the last couple of them, but it's only the last resort. There are several things that we need to try to do first. You can't save them once they're in the zoo. Once they're in the zoo, they're pets. Reintroducing them back to the wild is almost impossible because they're so reliant on humans. So if the zoo is the last resort, what then are we supposed to be trying to do? All right, so let's look at this next slide. What we need to do is to preserve their habitat and ecosystem. Don't try to preserve the animal. Try to preserve the ecosystem. That way you get more than just the lion, more than just the elephant, more than just the Komodo dragon, more than just the panda. You get the whole ecosystem and everybody else that lives in it, all the other animals that live in it. So the most effective way to save a species is to protect their habitat. That is the most effective way to protect a species. Protect their habitat. Small plots of land for a single population are not enough. You can't just have a tiny bit. You need a big, huge area, because a species confined to a small area, they can be wiped out easily by a natural disaster. Maybe there's a hurricane or a flood or a tornado in that one area, and if that one area is the only place you have that animal, I mean, you can't tell a hurricane to turn around. You can't tell a tornado to turn around because you have endangered species in that spot. You can't do that. Natural disasters can wipe them out and there won't be anything you can do. And a lot of other species require a huge range to find their adequate food. The hunters, they need a big space to spread out to hunt. And if you have a small population, they're not going to be able, the small plot of land, they're not going to be able to spread out. Therefore, protecting the habitats of endangered and threatened species also means preserving and managing large areas. So we need to preserve the areas. You know, like they have giant safari parks, not small safari parks, giant safari parks. That's what we need to preserve. That's what we need to protect. We need to preserve their habitats and ecosystem. Trouble is, we've got so many cities and so many people. let's talk about their conservation strategies. How can we try to balance what we need for these animals with what we need for our humans? Many conservationists are now giving priority to protecting entire ecosystems rather than an individual species. As we said, it makes a lot more sense, and you're more likely to have a chance of success if you save the entire ecosystem, not just the species. So by doing this, we might be able to save most of the species in that ecosystem, not just one. Instead of only the ones that have been identified as endangered, we can save everybody at this time. So that's so much better. Not just the ones who are threatened and endangered, we can save them all. The general public has now begun to understand the Earth's biosphere depends on all of its connected ecosystems. It took a long time to get just general ideas across as to telling just regular people how much the Earth and the ecosystems matter. Okay, it took a really long time, but it's beginning to come around where more and more people realize how important it is that we protect nature and we protect ecosystems. So we are making progress. Some of the other conservation strategies, do you remember learning about hotspots? Okay, most of the conservationists are going to focus on hotspots that we just talked about earlier to protect the biodiversity worldwide, and they also support these additional strategies here. Remember, the hotspots are the areas where you have a whole bunch of endangered animals in one space, like Madagascar, like from the cartoon. But the island of Madagascar is a hotspot because there are so many species in that area that are endangered on that one island. So as being able to save as much of Madagascar and leave it wild as possible, we can save even more animals that way. So focusing on the hot spots to preserve is one of the strategies. And the strategy there is to identify areas of native habitat that can be preserved and restored and linked into larger networks. So let's say there's like Africa is usually a really good example. You got a safari here, an area here that's a safari owned by this one company, and another safari park down here owned by another company, linking those two networks so that the animals can move between them. Okay, so we want to preserve as much land as possible, restore it back to nature, and then link it into larger networks. And another promising strategy is to promote the products that have been harvested with sustainable practices. The money's got to come from somewhere. So within these safari parks or these preserved ecosystems, if we can find something to make money off of in order to preserve, like if let's just talk about Madagascar. Okay, there are people who want to live there. There are people who want to develop the area for humans. And if it's just jungle and it's not making anybody any money, then they're going to want to break it down for people to live, to make a living. They're not just going to save it just to save it because it's the right thing to do, which it is. They're not going to save it just because that's right. But they will save it if they can make a profit off of it. And you know how people work. They will save it if they can make a profit off of it. So if there are items in there that can be used sustainably, like certain rocks turned into sculptures, or trees that have already fallen, using those woods for sculptures, real high end, or the main thing, I don't know if we're going to talk about it on the next slide, is ecotourism. If we can keep these places natural, the rich people will come and see. The rich people will want to come and see, and then we can charge buttloads of money from the rich people, and that will help sustain the ecosystems. Then nobody will need to cut it down because they're getting money off of the ecosystem as it stands. They're getting money to leave it whole rather than getting money to tear it up. Again, there's a lot more study needed. Just like we said before, there's always more study. So conservationists emphasize on the urgent need for more serious studies of the workings of species and ecosystems. How do species work within their ecosystem? That's one of the things we need to find out. Only in recent decades has there been much research into the basic questions like how much fragmentation can a particular ecosystem tolerate? Look at this picture up here. This area is green. You see these trees? Okay, this area is green, so the animals could walk along these green spaces, but we have fields and other stuff blocking all the stuff. So a cougar, a puma, mountain lion, even turtles and foxes, they can't cut across this way. They'll get caught. some prey animal will catch them, or the humans will catch them or something, so they can't cut across. They can only stay in these forested places, and the whole ecosystem is fragmented. Look back behind here. Do you see this ecosystem as a whole? This is what it's supposed to look like. So the question is, how much fragmentation can this ecosystem tolerate? And then the answers to those questions asked now can take years or decades to figure it out. So if you are interested in this, this could be your job, your career. You can definitely help the world in finding answers to these questions. But decisions that are affecting biodiversity continue to be made based on the available information. So environmental policy is a degree that you could get, because we have to make decisions based on what we know now, even though we know that what we know is not complete. We don't know everything yet, but we still need to make decisions on what we have. So if lawyer and politics is one of your things, environmental policy is a great option for you. It'd be wonderful. Especially here, when we get into legal protection of species, this is what we're talking about. Environmental policy. Many nations have set up laws and regulations that are designed to prevent the extinction of species, and USA is one of the strongest that we have to protect species. For example, in 1973, the U.S. passed the Endangered Species Act, and it was designed to protect any plant or animal. Now, please don't forget the plants. Any plant or animal species in danger of extinction. Remember that plants determine the whole ecosystem. Plants determine the biome. Plants are incredibly important. Plants determine what animal can live there. Plants determine how much temperature and humidity and all that stuff. If we don't pay attention to the plants that are becoming extinct, the animals are just going to fall away. So please don't forget the plants when we're talking about extinctions. We just automatically think animals. We got to think plants. So some of the U.S. laws under the first provision of the Endangered Species Act, again, when was the Endangered Species Act passed? 1973, so it's pretty old. Okay, so there's been a lot of stuff happening since then. So one of the first provisions of the Endangered Species Act is that the Fish and Wildlife Service has to compile a list of all the endangered and threatened species in the United States. So as of 2002, there were 983 species of plants and animals were listed. So every year they've come up with a new list. Okay, it's called the Red List. We're going to see it in a second. The second main provision of the Endangered Species Acts protect those listed species from human harm. All right, so first step in the Endangered Species Act is the Fish and Wildlife Service makes a list. Second step, protects those on the list from any human harm. The third prevents the federal government from carrying out any project that jeopardizes these animals. Okay, so the first thing that happens, they make a list. Second thing that happens, that everything on this list is protected from human harm. Third, you are prevented from any project that might jeopardize these animals. However, okay, if you get between big business and their money, you're going to have a lot of fights, right? This goes over, this is in your notes, it goes over the specifics of the Endangered Species Act. There will be a couple of questions on it on the test. All right, the stuff I just talked about and here. Make sure you're paying attention. But the trouble is, there's the fourth act, sorry, the fourth portion, the fourth provision is that the Fish and Wildlife Services has to provide a recovery plan for each listed species. So again, the four parts. First, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife makes a list. Second, everything on that list is protected from human harm. Third, there can be no project, real estate or anything else, development, anything kind of project that will cause damage to this species that they listed. And fourth, they have to make a recovery plan to see what they can do to help them. These plans will often propose to protect or restore habitat for each species. Remember, habitat's the key. If you can protect their habitat, you can protect the species. However, these attempts to restrict human uses, excuse us. Okay, so sorry about that. We had an announcement on the thing. All right, so with the four parts of the Endangered Species Act, first they make a list of all the animals and plants that are endangered. Second, no human harm can come to these animals, these species, plants and animals. Don't forget the plants. Third, no project can be undertaken, whether it's development or architecture or agriculture, no human project can harm these animals or their habitats. And fourth, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife has to make a recovery plan to see what they can do to help these animals, these species. And usually what they're doing with recovery plans is they're making a habitat, trying to preserve the habitat. Now, this is what I was getting to just before the interruption. If you get between big business and their plans to make money, you're going to have a fight on your hands. You can't come between these business people and their money. So restricting human uses of this land is controversial. Like the real estate developers and all this, they might be prohibited from building in certain areas, and people may lose their home, their income, not their home. They might lose their income. They're going to get mad if their interests are placed below some other species. There was a show I was watching. The spotted owl is a tiny little owl, and he needed a large habitat in order to survive. And so in the ecosystem where this spotted owl lived, nobody was allowed to build anything. Nobody was allowed to develop anything. No buildings were allowed. No roads were allowed. And the people got mad because they wanted that prime developers land. And so there's a lot of fights within the Endangered Species Act and businesses. And again, this was first made in the 70s, so there have been a lot of adjustment made to it, and they still fight all the time. So battles, full-on battles between environmentalists and developers are widely publicized, and in most cases they find compromises eventually to work things out. One form of a compromise is a habitat conservation plan. Okay, a habitat conservation plan is a land use plan that attempts to protect the threatened or endangered species, but allows some trade-offs between harm to the species and additional conservation commitments among parties. It means if you see this area here, this is an estuary, or a what's the other word for estuary? Anyway, where a river joins into the sea. Estuary. There's another word for it. It's gone. But these are very, very delicate as far as species goes, as far as development goes. Pollution, of course, is a huge issue here. So keeping humans out of these kind of areas and leaving them for the animals is really, really important, because they are so delicate but also so important. But the developers really want these areas, and so you have to find compromises between the cooperating parties. So the habitat conservation plan is one of the ways that you can have a trade-off. Now, when we are talking about endangered species, it has to be international cooperation, not just one state, one nation. It has to be international. So at a global level, there's a group called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. It's much easier. Okay, International Union for the Conservation of Nature. It facilitates efforts to protect species and habitats. So these guys are in charge of bringing everybody to the table so that they can have discussions on what to do about endangered species. They work on a global level. On a U.S. level, we'll do the Endangered Species Act and we'll do the Environmental Protection Agency. That's here at U.S. level. But when we go up to global, it's the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So that's their global one. They published the red list. Remember I said they had to determine who all was endangered, which species were endangered. So they published these red lists that are endangered of extinction around the world to advise governments on ways to manage their natural resources. They make a new list every year to see which species are still endangered, which species have moved from threatened up to endangered, and luckily here lately some have moved from endangered down to threatened, and some have even fallen off the red list altogether as we're working very, very hard to try to protect things. So some of the things do work, and this red list will tell us which species are currently in danger. They'll also advise governments on ways to manage their resources, and they work with groups like the World Wildlife Fund to sponsor projects like to stop poaching in Uganda. That's one of the things World Wildlife does, and we're going to talk about some of the other private efforts here. These are all government efforts. Okay, so this is government efforts. The Environmental Protection Agency, following the Endangered Species Act, that's U.S., and then internationally you have the IUCN, and they bring everything together. So those are two government agencies. On the next slide, nope, we're still talking government. Okay, so the international trade and poaching. So poaching is one of the main things that we have to be aware of and fight against when these animals are endangered. One product of the IUCN has been the international treaty called CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So when you realize that we can't have, like my family, we have a bearded dragon, okay, which are native to Australia. You cannot get native Australian bearded dragons. You can only get bearded dragons who are bred here in the U.S. from a certain few species that were legally allowed out of Australia to be bred here in the U.S. for this purpose as pets. This CITES trade in endangered species, means that people can't just keep going to Australia to get more bearded dragons. Okay, you have to buy them here within the United States from approved breeders. And this is important to protect the bearded dragons and protect their habitats. Chameleons, I'm pretty sure, are the same way. Chameleons are endangered, but when you're trying to get a chameleon, you can only buy from registered breeders here in the U.S. who are breeding them, captive breeding. They are not going back out into the jungles to get more. All sorts of animals, pet species especially, follow under this treaty called CITES, that will not let you trade endangered species. The CITES treaties was the first one effective. It also to stop the slaughter of African elephants. So it's not just a pet trade. It's big important stuff like poaching. They were slaughtering the African elephants to sell the ivory in their tusks. Okay, their teeth here. That they're made of ivory, and they would use that for carving and all sorts of other stuff, and they're very expensive. And so the poachers would kill the elephant and just take their ivory. Okay, and of course elephants have a very complex society, almost as complex as a human society. It's not like you can take a member of their family and they wouldn't notice. It's just like the U.S. They will grieve. I mean, not the U.S., the humans. They will grieve. They have long memories of family and family unions. They will go back to where an elephant died periodically through the years and pay respect to where that elephant fell, remembering their family members. So when the poachers do this, it's not only horrendous just for the fact that the elephant is an endangered species and it shouldn't be killed, but it's also horrendous for what you are doing to their family unit. All right, so the poachers was getting a handle on the poachers was and continues to be a huge effort that the CITES treaties is working against. And again, they work with place called groups like the World Wildlife Federation and other groups that are private groups. CITES is a government group, international government, but they will also work with the private companies to do the best they can. In 1989, the members of the CITES proposed a total ban on all sales, imports, and exports of ivory, hoping to put a stop to the problem. So they banned the sale of ivory. Now that is a positive and a negative possible, because some people worried that if you make ivory trading illegal, it's going to increase the rate with the poaching because it's going to increase the cost. You make something rare, its price goes up, and therefore the poachers would be worse. But they didn't. It worked. It was great. They argued at first that illegal ivory, like illegal drugs, might sell for a higher price. But after the ban was enacted, the price of ivory dropped and poaching declined dramatically. So it did work. So it's one of the ways, one of the positive answers for what we can do with environmentalism. There we go. All right. So the stop on poaching was very good to help, and the cities the cities treaties helped along with that, and that was put forth by the IUCN. So try to think back of what the stuff we're putting all together here. Now, another effort, one of the most ambitious efforts to tackle environmental issues was a worldwide scale, was the United Nations Conference on Environmental Development, also known as the First Earth Summit. Okay, when you've heard about the United Nations. Okay, you know the United Nations, where all of the governments get together. They had this thing called an Earth Summit. Okay, it's a very important result of the Earth Summit was the Biodiversity Treaty. And again, these are the governments of the whole world, okay, working together. The Biodiversity Treaty was an international agreement aimed at strengthening national control and preservation of biological resources. So trying to preserve our biodiversity, trying to preserve our natural resources, working together to have better control so that we don't just lose all of our ecosystems while like some lumber company cutting everything down. So the biodiversity treaties, the treaty's goal was to preserve biodiversity and ensure the sustainable and fair use of genetic resources in all countries. Because usually the big countries who have the things they need will say, save the world. Don't take all the fishes, don't kill all the monkeys. But you get the poor people who said, yeah, those monkeys and those fishes are our food, sir, so we'll take what we need. So so you have to get all nations together on the same page. So the treaty took several years to be adopted and by the U.S. So we were one of the worst at dragging our feet to get this handled. Some political groups objected to the treaty, especially the suggestion that the economic and trade agreements should take into account any impacts on biodiversity that might result from the agreements. So what they were saying is, they were trying to plan for future agreements rather than what they were having now, and it just took the U.S. a long time to agree to this. But now the private organizations are actually they work much more effectively than government agencies. If you can get a private agency to do something, they don't have to worry about government red tape, waiting for committees, voter regulation. They don't have to worry about anything else. The private organizations can work much more effectively, quickly, and with a clearer purpose than the governments, because you have to please so many people in the government. These private companies are actually doing a better job. For example, the World Wildlife Fund, we talked about that one. Sustainable use of resources supports wildlife protection. These are the guys who fight against poaching. Then you have the Nature Conservancy, help purchase millions of hectares of habitat preserves in 29 countries. So the Nature Conservancy protects ecosystems. Okay, world wildlife, mostly sustainable use of resources and poaching. Nature Conservancy protecting the land. Conservation International helps to identify the biodiversity hotspots, the places we need to protect. So Conservation International finds the spots. And then Greenpeace International organizes direct and sometimes confrontational, let me move my face, confrontational what? Actions. Confrontational actions. So if you need, Greenpeace is like the army. All right, so if you think about, they're the ones who are going to get militant. They're the ones who are going to be up in somebody's face. They're the ones, if something is so bad and somebody needs to be yelled at, it'll be Greenpeace doing the yelling. All right, so these four are some of the main environmental, private environmental agencies who are doing big work and good work. Okay, World Wildlife Fund, protecting resources and fighting against poaching. Nature Conservancy, protecting the ecosystems, trees and such. Conservation International helps to find the hotspots, and Greenpeace, they are your army. Okay, they are the ones who will get militant and get up in people's faces if it needs to be done. Okay, the biggest problem is we've got to find a way to balance what humans need compared to what the animals need, the ecosystems and nature. We got to balance human needs versus nature's needs. So the attempts to protect the species often comes in conflict with the interests of the world's humans and inhabitants. Okay, like I said, if I'm a farmer and I need to plant corn in this area right here, you can't tell me that I need to leave it for a forest because some worm needs the space. All right, so, or some little bug or some little bee. Well, bees are important, I'm going to say, but you see the people's I'm going to say keep the ecosystem every time. But you can imagine humans, they need, say, I need this land to grow corn for my family. I'm not going to save it for the jungle animals. I need to feed my family. Do you see how the, pause, hold on. Sorry about that. We had another announcement. Okay, so again, so let's say this farmer needs this plot of land to grow corn for his family. He's not going to want to leave it as jungle for some random animals if his family is starving. So we have got to find some way to balance human needs versus nature. All right, so an endangered species might represent a source of income or a source of food or income, or a given species may not seem valuable to those who don't understand the species' role in the ecosystem. This is why we've got to protect all animals, not just the pretty and cuddly ones. All right, people may not realize how important this animal is, this species is, or if it's food or income, if they don't have anything else, they're not going to try to protect it. If they need that animal for food, they're going to take that animal for food. Okay, so many conservationists feel that an important part of protecting species is making the value of biodiversity understood by more people. They've got to make sure that people understand why it's important. Plus, they're going to need to offer them something in exchange. Right? I don't care how important the elephant is. If my children are starving, my children are starving. So that makes a big deal. Okay? So we've got to find ways. There are, again, whole areas of environmental policy where they are trying to balance human versus nature's needs. So going through, these are our comprehension questions. What's a captive breeding program? You can scroll back and see. What is germplasm? The Endangered Species Act. When was it passed? What is a habitat conservation plan? What is cities? And what's a biodiversity treaty? All of these things were covered in this slide, so go back and check them, and I'll see you the next time. Bye, you guys.